Looking back, it feels obvious that the end of my marriage was only the prologue to something much darker, but at the time I was foolish enough to believe silence meant peace. You don't spend a quarter of a century with someone and actually know the hidden rooms of their mind, not the ones with locks on the doors. I had been living alone for a little over a year and a half when the morning came that reset my understanding of the word quiet. It was early autumn, the kind of pale, cool morning that makes coffee taste better, and I was standing in my narrow kitchen in a faded work shirt, staring at a crack in the wall I kept meaning to fix, when three sharp blows landed on my front door. They weren't polite knocks. They were declarations. My name is Elias Crow. I was 61 then, and for more than 3 decades I run pressure systems and filtration lines at the Meridian Materials plant outside Redstone, Arizona, a job that paid steadily and asked little imagination in return, which was fine because imagination doesn't always keep the lights on. I'd raised a daughter on that paycheck, bought a modest house, and retired with what I thought was a dependable pension, believing I'd finally earned slow mornings and fewer surprises. The divorce from Marable had been ugly but final, at least that's what I told myself. And when I opened the door to see two county investigators standing in the weak sunlight, I felt the cold reach places the air couldn't, because some part of me already understood that she had never really left my life at all. The woman introduced herself as Investigator Nora Ivers, her partner, a younger man named Cade Linton, and they both had that practiced stillness of people who have learned to let others talk themselves into trouble. Behind them, curtains twitched and a neighbor across the street suddenly found a reason to rearrange his recycling bin, the small-town audience always eager for a new performance. Ivers asked me to confirm my name, and then told me, in a voice that sounded like it had delivered bad news before, that several credit applications had been submitted under my identity over the past year. The amounts, she said, ranged from just under 8,000 to nearly 14, and together they added up to a number that made my stomach tight. I told her the truth, which was that I lived on my retirement checks and hadn't borrowed a cent, and she wrote something down without changing her expression. Linton added that each application carried my signature, and that was the moment my hands started to tremble, because the past has a way of stepping out of corners you thought were empty. I didn't say Marable's name, but I didn't need to. Ivers asked if I would come to the station the next afternoon to answer questions, and the way she phrased it made it clear that cooperation was not optional if I wanted anyone to believe me. After they left, I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, aware of every watching eye, and when I finally closed the door, the little rental I'd moved into after the divorce felt smaller, as if the walls had learned how to lean. Cal Rourke, who lived 2 houses down and had retired from highway patrol a few years before I did, didn't bother with ceremony and pushed through my screen door like he always did when he thought something was wrong. He had the square build of someone who never quite leaves uniform behind, and he listened without interrupting while I told him what the investigators had said. When I finished, he just nodded once and said Marable's name out loud, not as an accusation but as a conclusion, the way you say rain when you see clouds rolling in. We sat at my small table with a pot of coffee between us and spread out the old divorce papers, the ones that had divided a life into neat legal sentences, and he pointed to the clause that said any new debt belonged to whoever created it. It should have been simple, but nothing ever is when someone knows your history as well as your numbers. I told him how she'd called months after I moved out, claiming she needed my social security number to finish the last joint tax filing, and how I'd given it to her without thinking, because old habits don't vanish just because lawyers say they should. Cal didn't say, "I told you so," but he didn't have to. The look on his face said that trust, once spent, is very hard to earn back, and that I'd handed over a weapon without realizing it was loaded. My phone lit up while we were still talking, and the name on the screen was my daughter, Tessa, returning one of the messages I'd left earlier. She worked long shifts at a rehabilitation clinic in Mesa, and when she spoke, Her voice carried that professional calm people use when they're trying not to let emotion get the upper hand. She said her mother had already called her, said the police were asking questions because I'd taken out loans and was trying to pin it on her, said I'd been harassing her, and each sentence felt like another rung breaking under my feet. I told Tessa the truth as steadily as I could, that I hadn't spoken to Marable since the divorce was signed, that I could prove I'd been elsewhere on some of the dates in question, that someone was using my name like a mask. There was a long silence, and then she said she couldn't be in the middle of it, that she had patients waiting, and that maybe we should all just stop. When the call ended, the quiet was heavier than before, and Cal, bless him, pretended to be very interested in refilling his mug so I wouldn't have to see the sympathy on his face. After he left, I called the attorney who'd handled the divorce, because sometimes you don't choose the fight chooses you, and this one had already started whether I liked it or not. The station smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, and I arrived early with a folder full of documents that suddenly felt like a shield made of cardboard. Investigator Ivers slid copies of the applications across the desk and told me to look closely, and she was right. The signature was close enough to mine to fool someone who wanted to be fooled, but wrong in small ways only I would notice, loops where I never made them, a slant I never used. She pointed out a notary stamp and said the notary claimed to have met me, and I said I'd never seen that person in my life. Then she showed me statements from one of the accounts, charges at restaurants I didn't visit, stores I never shopped in, a lease payment on a sedan I'd never driven, and a resort bill that made my throat go dry because I could place myself in a different city on those dates, sitting in a hospital room with my brother while he recovered from surgery. Ivers listened, wrote notes, and finally said something that hurt more than the evidence, which was that cases like this often involved cooperation, that sometimes people tried to walk away from debt by claiming fraud when things got out of hand. I told her she was wrong, but I understood why she'd think it, and when she said not to leave town and that they'd be in touch, I walked out feeling like every badge in the building was weighing my pockets down. Cal was waiting by my truck when I got home, and he didn't waste time with small talk. He'd called in a favor and gotten a copy of Marable's credit history, and the numbers told a story that matched my gut, a sharp drop after the divorce, rejection after rejection, a person running out of legitimate options. He also told me he'd tracked down the notary, a woman who worked out of a shipping store, and that she'd admitted, in writing, that someone matching Marable's description had paid cash for stamps without proper checks. It wasn't a confession, but it was a crack in the wall, and sometimes that's all you need to start pulling bricks. A few days later, a reporter from the local paper called and said my name had come up in connection with a fraud investigation, and before I could even finish saying no comment, he mentioned that Marable had filed for a protective order, claiming I'd been calling and threatening her. The room tilted. I hadn't contacted her at all, but lies travel faster than explanations, and by the time I hung up, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that promised I'd pay for what I'd done. Cal told me to save everything, because anger makes people careless, and careless people leave trails. The letter from the retirement board arrived 2 mornings later, formal and polite and devastating, explaining that my monthly benefits were suspended pending the outcome of an investigation, as if a life could be put on hold with a paragraph and a signature. I did the math, saw the cliff edge, and then the bank called to say I was behind on a loan against my truck, a loan I'd never taken, secured with a title I'd never signed away. That truck was one of the last things my father and I had chosen together before he passed, and the idea of losing it to someone else's crime felt like another kind of theft. Cal sat with me on the porch and said she was trying to break me in pieces, because broken things don't fight back as hard, and then he showed me something else he'd found, a social media page belonging to a councilman named Adrian Vale, smiling with his family in front of a vacation resort, the dates lining up too neatly with one of the fraudulent disbursements. Marable had left me for him, and whether he was stupid or complicit, The money didn't care. It just moved where it was told. The texts kept coming, taunts dressed up as grievances, and when I answered one the way Cal suggested, asking what I'd supposedly taken from her, the replies came fast and bitter, a ledger of imagined debts and justifications that read like a confession written in anger. She said she deserved what she'd taken, that she was only collecting, and when I asked if Vale knew what she was doing, the answer wasn't a denial so much as a challenge. Then, in the middle of a sleepless night, Tessa called from the clinic and asked me to come, not because she was hurt, but because she needed to talk. In a small consultation room that smelled like disinfectant and tired hope, she told me she'd gone to her mother's house and found stacks of my mail opened on the kitchen table, statements and notices going back months, and that Marable had raged when she started taking pictures, saying she'd planned this since before the divorce, that she was going to drain me and disappear. Tessa showed me the photos, and then she showed me a recording she'd made of the argument, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in my chest loosened just enough to let air in. When Marable called while we were still there and I put her on speaker, she didn't know her daughter was listening, and she said the quiet parts out loud, the threats, the certainty that she couldn't be touched, and when Tessa spoke, calm and unafraid, the line went dead. We took everything to investigator Ivers the next morning, Cal with the notary statement, Tessa with the photos and the recording, me with a list of dates and places, and the tone in that office changed like weather. Ivers said she owed me an apology and that they were bringing Marable in, and that Vale would have questions to answer as well. The retirement board reinstated my checks a few days later, the bank froze the repossession, and for the first time in a while, the future stopped looking like a locked door. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it had shifted, and when a threat arrived by text that night, promising regret, I saved it and went to bed, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sleep before a long day. The next call surprised me. A pastor from a church Marable had been attending, asking to meet about financial irregularities, and Cal insisted on coming with me. In a quiet office that smelled of lemon polish and old books, the pastor spread out ledgers and explained that small amounts had been vanishing from a building fund, then larger ones, adding up to a number that mirrored the loans in my name, and that Marable had access through her volunteer role. Worse, they'd found applications opened in the names of elderly members she'd been helping, people who trusted her because the church told them she was trustworthy. Detective Ivers arrived later to collect records, and that afternoon she called to say Vale had been arrested and was ready to trade his version of the truth for leniency, and that Marable had been planning to leave the country with false papers. I sat on my balcony that evening with Tessa and Cal, the city breathing around us, and felt something like the end of a storm, not because everything was fixed, but because the sky had finally started to clear. The weeks that followed blurred together in a way that made calendars feel like suggestions instead of facts, but certain moments stayed sharp, like glass underfoot. Investigator Ivers called often, sometimes just to confirm a small detail, sometimes to tell me they uncovered another thread Marable had pulled loose and left dangling, and each call was a reminder that the life I thought I'd left behind was still unraveling in public. The local news ran a short segment about Councilman Vale's arrest, careful with words but heavy with implication, and neighbors who had once pretended not to watch suddenly found reasons to wave or look away. Tessa came by more frequently, bringing groceries or sitting at my small table with her laptop open, helping me organize documents and timelines as if we were building a case file out of the wreckage of our own history. She was quieter than usual, but there was a steadiness to her that I recognized as resolve, the same look she'd worn as a teenager when she decided she was done being afraid of thunderstorms and stood on the porch to prove it. One afternoon, she told me she'd given a formal statement about the recording and the mail, and that her hands had shaken the whole time, not from doubt, but from anger that had nowhere else to go. I told her anger could be useful if you didn't let it drive, and she laughed at that, a short sound, but it felt like progress. When Marable was finally brought in, it wasn't dramatic in the way television teaches us to expect. No flashing lights in my driveway or shouted commands. Just a phone call from Ivers saying they had her in an interview room, and that the charges were stacking up faster than her excuses. Vale, it turned out, had tried to play both sides, offering partial truths like coins at a toll booth. But paper has a way of remembering more than people do, and the money trail didn't care about his speeches or his family photos. The pastor from the church provided records that showed patterns too neat to be accidental, and a few of the elderly members came forward, embarrassed and furious, with stories about forms they'd been asked to sign and accounts they didn't remember opening. Listening to those stories secondhand made my chest ache in a way that was different from anything Marable had done to me personally, because it was one thing to steal from someone who knew your flaws and another to prey on people who only knew your smile. Cal said that was the line most juries cared about, not because it was worse in dollars, but because it showed intent without camouflage. The formal charges arrived in a thick envelope that looked heavier than paper had any right to, and my attorney walked me through them like someone reading a weather report that included the word hurricane. Identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation, conspiracy, and a few others that sounded abstract until you remembered they were all just different names for the same act of turning trust into leverage. Marable's lawyer filed motions that felt more like noise than substance, arguing about procedures and timelines, and for a while it seemed like everything would stretch on forever. But then dates appeared on calendars and people started talking about juries and exhibits. Tessa asked me once if I planned to be in the courtroom every day, and I told her I didn't know, because part of me wanted to see it through, and part of me wanted to skip ahead to the part where it was over. Cal said being there wasn't about satisfaction, it was about witnessing, about not letting someone else write the last draft of your own story, and I decided he was right, even if the idea of sitting across from Marable in public made my stomach knot. The first day of the trial was quieter than I expected, more like waiting for a bus than bracing for a storm, but when she walked in, I felt the room tilt in that familiar way, as if gravity had learned a new direction. She looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just reduced, like a photograph printed too many times, and she didn't look at me, which was almost worse than if she had. The prosecution laid out the outline in careful, patient sentences, the way you explain a complicated recipe to someone who's never cooked, and the defense responded with words about misunderstanding and stress, and how easy it is for paperwork to go wrong. When the notary testified about taking cash and not checking IDs, her voice shook, and I realized how many people get pulled into someone else's choices without ever meaning to. When the church treasurer spoke, there were tears, not for the money, but for the sense of having invited a fox into a henhouse and called it hospitality. Tessa took the stand on the third day, and I watched her walk up there with the same posture she used at work, shoulders back, chin level, the stance of someone who refuses to be smaller than the room. She described finding the mail, the argument, the recording, and the words sounded different in that space, amplified by microphones and expectation, but they were still the truth, and that counted for something. The defense tried to suggest she'd misunderstood, that emotions had colored her memory, and she answered with the calm of someone who has measured pain and knows the difference between blur and clarity. When she stepped down, she didn't look at me, but she squeezed my hand on the way past, and I knew she was doing that for both of us, a small anchor in a place designed to make people drift. Vale testified near the end, and if I ever needed proof that ambition has a shelf life, he was it, a man trying to trade yesterday's confidence for tomorrow's mercy. He said Marable had planned it, that she'd shown him how the numbers could be moved and the signatures copied, that he'd told himself it was temporary and then told himself it was too late to stop, and the room listened in the way people listen to storms they can't avoid. The defense objected to half of what he said, and the judge sustained some of it and overruled the rest, but the shape of the story was already there, and no amount of trimming was going to make it unrecognizable. When it was over and both sides rested, the waiting began again, a different kind of quiet, one that buzzed instead of echoing. The jury took most of a day, and I spent it walking the small park across from the courthouse, counting steps and trying not to imagine every possible outcome like a deck of cards being shuffled in the dark. When they came back, the foreperson's voice was steady, and the words were simple, and I felt something unclench that I hadn't known was still holding. Guilty, on every count that mattered, and the courtroom exhaled in a way that sounded like relief mixed with exhaustion. Marable didn't look at me then either, but I didn't need her to. The verdict had said what needed saying. Sentencing came later, and the number of years was less important to me than the fact that there was an end date to the damage, a horizon you could finally see even if you couldn't reach it yet. Life didn't snap back into place the way people sometimes promise it will, but it did start to move again, which turned out to be enough. The pension checks resumed, the bank cleared the false loan, and a small settlement from one of the institutions that had been too eager to accept paperwork without questions helped me put a down payment on a modest condo not far from where I'd been renting, a place with a balcony that caught the late afternoon light and a park you could hear if you opened the windows. Cal helped me move in, carrying boxes and offering commentary on my terrible taste in furniture, and Tessa brought lunch and insisted on arranging the kitchen like she'd be the one cooking there every day. We stood in the empty living room and listened to our footsteps echo, and it felt less like claiming territory and more like marking a fresh page. The calls from Ivers slowed and then stopped, not because she'd forgotten, but because there were fewer loose ends to chase. And one afternoon, she left a voicemail saying they'd identified a few more people Marable had tried to use through the church, and that those cases were being handled now, which made me feel like the story was still doing some good even after it stopped being mine. Tessa started seeing someone from work, a physical therapist with an easy laugh, and she told me about it over takeout on my new balcony, the city humming below us like a machine that hadn't noticed our particular breakdown and repair. I told her I was glad she was happy, and I meant it in a way that felt lighter than words usually do. Sometimes, late at night, I still caught myself replaying old conversations, wondering where the exits had been and why I hadn't used them sooner, but those thoughts came and went like weather now instead of settling in. Cal said that's what recovery looks like when it's honest, not a clean line upward, but a series of smaller circles that don't close as tightly as they used to. I found small rituals that helped, morning walks, a plant on the balcony that refused to die even when I forgot to water it, a shelf for the books I'd meant to read for years and never had time for. None of it was dramatic, but it was mine, and that turned out to be the point. On the day the last piece of paperwork came through, the kind that closes a file and sends it to storage, Tessa brought over a six-pack and we sat outside and watched the light fade from the buildings across the park. She said she was proud of me, not for winning anything, but for not disappearing when it would have been easier to do that, and I told her I'd had help, which was true in ways I was still learning to count. We talked about her work, about Cal's terrible jokes, about the neighbor downstairs who practiced saxophone at unreasonable hours, and it felt like a conversation people have when they're not bracing for impact anymore. I don't pretend the past became harmless just because it was finished, but it did become quieter, and in that quiet I learned to hear other things, like the way a city breathes at night, and the way a good day doesn't need witnesses to be real. If there's a lesson in any of it, it's not the tidy kind you can put on a poster, just the simple truth that control and love are not the same word, and that survival sometimes looks like refusing to let someone else keep editing your life after they've lost the right. I didn't get the life I planned, but I got a life that belongs to me, and that turned out to be worth more than any number anyone ever wrote next to my name.